One night in Minnesota, the police were parked on the street just beyond the Sons of Norway Hall, and it was about closing time, and they were looking to pick up somebody for a DWI, and it wasn't long before Ole came out onto the porch, and he was swaying a little, and they thought, well, we'll get one here, and so he stood on the porch for a few minutes, and a few of his friends left the hall, and they gave him a goodnight slap on the back, and they drove away. And well, finally Ole attempted to go down the stairs, and he was stumbling a little, and he finally made it to the bottom, and then he leaned on the handrail. And the police, they can hardly wait for him to get to his car and drive away. While he rests, a few more friends leave and bid him good night, and finally Ole staggers over to his car. And it takes him several attempts to get his keys into the door, but he finally gets it open. He climbs in, and he kind of fell forward and hit the horn with his forehead. The horn, it blasts and startles him, and finally he puts the key in the ignition and starts the car. And the police are getting impatient, but they know they can't do anything until he leaves the parking lot. So finally he gets the car in gear, pulls forward, stops, backs up, stops. By now the parking lot is just about empty, and Ole, he finally pulls onto the street. And the minute he does, the police are right behind him with their lights flashing.
Uh-oh.
And Ole, he pulls over, and one of the officers walks up to the door, and he says, have you had a little too much to drink tonight, Ole? And Ole says, oh no, I just had Coca-Cola. And well, the officer says, I think you need to take a sobriety test for us. And yeah, sure, says Ole. So he gets out of the car, and the officer asks him to close his eyes and stick out his arm and touch his fingers to his nose. And the officer is surprised, so he says to Ole, can you walk a straight line? And Ole performs flawlessly. And I'm surprised you're doing so well, Ole. Would you mind taking a breath test for us? No, I don't mind. And so he takes the test, and nothing registers. And the officer says, Ole, I don't understand. We watched you leave Norway Hall, and you appear to have been drinking quite a lot. And no, said Ole, tonight I was the designated decoy.
Woot!
That's a good one. That's a good one.
They're getting harder and harder to find now these days, though.
Oh my God, that was awesome.
I might have one more.
All right.
Please.
The guys, they all went to deer camp, and they had to bunk two to a room, and nobody wanted to stay with Ole because he was snored so much. And they decided it wasn't fair to make one of them stay with him the whole time they were at deer camp, so they thought they would take turns. And Lars slept with Ole, and he came to breakfast the next morning with his hair in a mess, and his eyes were bloodshot, and they says, what happened to you? And he said, Ole, he snored so loud, I just sat up and watched him all night. And the next night it was Hjalmar's turn, and in the morning the same thing, hair all standing up, bloodshot eyes, and they said, what happened to you? You look awful. And Hjalmar said, man, that Ole shakes the roof. I sat up and I watched him all night. And the third night it was Sven's turn. Now Sven was a big ex-football player, a real man's man, and next morning he came to breakfast and he was bright-eyed, and he looked rested up, and good morning, he said, and they couldn't believe it. And they says, what happened? And he says, well, we got ready for bed. I took Ole into bed, and I kissed him good night. So he sat up and watched me all night.
Oh my God.
Good job. Do you have another one? That was so fun.
Synnove. Oh
Well,
my
I
God.
suppose I could tell one more, but they're getting
Sometimes the old
lamer and
jokes are the
lamer.
good ones.
No, they're
That
getting
was
better
good.
and better.
Yeah.
More.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, maybe you want to hear about Ole and Lena's first baby.
Let's
Yeah.
hear
Oh,
it.
yes.
Bring it
Yeah,
up.
yeah.
Well, Lena, she's pregnant, and late one night she wakes up Ole and she says, I think it's time. So he started up the John Deere tractor and he took her to the hospital and to have their first baby. And so she had a little boy, and the doctor looked over at Ole and says, you've got a son, isn't that? Well, Ole, he got excited by this, but just then the doctor said, hold on, we're not finished yet. And then the doctor held up a little girl, and he says, hey, Ole, you got a daughter, and she's a pretty little thing, too. And Ole got kind of puzzled by this, and then the doctor said, well, we ain't done yet. And the doctor delivered another boy, and Ole says, the doctor says, Ole, you yourself another boy, and he was flabbergasted. A couple days later, Ole brought Lena and their 3 children home in the self-propelled combine, and he was real serious, and he asked Lena, how come we got 3 on the first try? And Lena says, well, you remember that night we ran out of Vaseline, and you went out in the barn and you got that 3-in-1 oil. Wally says, yeah, I do, oofta. It's a darn good thing I didn't get the WD-40.
Hey, that's good.